The tailor spent his days stitching rough canvas for sailors, but his heart lived in the silk-lined ballrooms of the upper city. He was a master of his craft, yet in his own eyes he was invisible because he wore the clothes of a commoner. One winter, an invitation to the Grand Gala arrived, a mistake perhaps, but to him, it was a summons to finally exist. To appear among the elite, he needed more than a suit. He needed a masterpiece. He went to a moneylender and signed a contract with a high interest rate. Using his small shop as collateral, he bought rare velvet from the East, gold-spun thread, and buttons carved from mother of pearl. For 3 weeks, he barely ate or slept. He poured every ounce of his skill into the garment. On the night of the gala, he stood before his mirror. He looked like a king. When he entered the ballroom, the room went silent. Heads turned. He heard the whispers. "Who is that magnificent gentleman?" For 4 hours, he was intoxicated by the nods of approval and the smiles of women who had never looked at him before. But the morning came with a cold reality. The first interest payment was due. Then the second. To keep the moneylender from taking his shop, he sold his furniture, then his high-quality tools, and finally his winter coat. He sat in his freezing, empty workspace, clutching the velvet suit, the only thing he had left. He realized that the suit didn't belong to him. He belonged to the suit. He had traded his future security for 4 hours of a stranger's fleeting attention. When the neighbors found him weeks later, he was frozen solid, draped in the most beautiful silk the city had ever seen. He had paid a lifetime of labor for a mirror that could only reflect a lie. A traveler was crossing a narrow mountain pass at twilight when he heard a sharp, panicked cry. "Help! I'm falling!" The voice sounded desperate, coming from the jagged shadows of the canyon below. The traveler's heart began to race. He didn't stop to look for a flashlight or a rope, he simply began to run toward the sound. As his boots pounded against the gravel, the cry came again, louder and more frantic. "Help! I'm falling!" The traveler began to scream back, "Hang on! I'm coming!" And the faster he yelled, the more terrified the voices in the canyon became. He was sprinting now, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every time his foot slipped, a new scream erupted from the darkness, sounding exactly like his own panic. He didn't realize that the canyon was shaped like a perfect acoustic funnel. There was no one else in the abyss. He was chasing the echo of his own fear. The faster he ran, the louder the victim cried out. The more he shouted, the more the environment confirmed that a catastrophe was happening. He was trapped in a self-generated loop of terror. Blinded by the adrenaline and the certainty of his own ears, he failed to see the path ending. He didn't notice the warning signs of the crumbling cliff edge because he was too busy responding to the emergency he had created. With one final, desperate leap toward the sound of the ghost, he flew into the empty air. As he fell, he finally understood the canyon wasn't trying to kill him. It was simply reflecting the chaos he brought into it. The only person he needed to save was the man who refused to be still long enough to hear the silence. The old steward had lived in the north wing of the fortress for 50 years. The royal family was long gone, the stone walls were cracked by ivy, and the great iron gates had been welded shut by decades of rust. The castle was no longer a seat of power. It was a ruin. Yet every morning at 5 a.m., the steward woke up, lit a single candle, and took out a heavy iron ring containing 12 massive keys. He spent 3 hours polishing them with oil and a rag until they gleamed like silver. These keys once opened the treasury, the armory, and the secret archives. To the steward, these keys were not just tools, they were his identity. Without them, he was just an old man in a graveyard. One day, a fire broke out in the lower kitchens. Thick, black smoke began to fill the corridors. A group of travelers outside the walls shouted through the bars, "Leave the castle! There is a small postern gate in the back that is unlocked." "Just run!" The steward grabbed his ring of keys and ran toward the main hall. He reached the door to the treasury, but the lock had long ago disintegrated into a solid block of orange rust. He tried the first key, then the second, his hands shaking. The keys were perfectly maintained, but the world they were meant to operate had changed. He refused to drop the heavy iron ring, even as the heat grew unbearable. The weight of the 12 keys slowed him down, pulling at his belt, making every step an agonizing struggle. He could have climbed through a broken window to safety, but his hands were full of the heavy iron. He died in the hallway, clutching the keys to doors that no longer existed. He realized in his final moments that a key is only an asset if there is still a lock to turn. If the door is gone, the key is just a piece of metal that anchors you to a burning house. The swordsman was legendary for his speed, a man who could split a falling leaf in mid-air. He was traveling to the high mountain pass for the duel that would define his life, a contest against the only rival who could match his skill. The stakes were absolute. The winner would claim the master's title, and the loser would vanish into obscurity. As he climbed the winding trail, the sun began to catch on a patch of wildflowers. Among them danced a swarm of iridescent butterflies, their wings shimmering with colors he had never seen in his village. He stopped. "Just a moment," he whispered, fascinated by the way the light hit their sapphire scales. He reached out and caught one, admiring its delicate structure. Further up the path, he found a gleaming stone in a creek bed, a raw emerald half buried in the silt. He knelt to dig it out, then found another and another. He began to fill his pockets, then his belt pouches, and finally he carried a few in his left hand. "These are rare," he reasoned. It would be foolish to leave wealth on the ground. By the time he reached the summit, he was breathing heavily, not from the climb, but from the weight of his finds. His rival was already there, standing still as a statue, his hands empty and his eyes fixed on the horizon. When the signal was given, the swordsman reached for his blade, but his fingers were slick with the dust of the emeralds. His left hand was still clenched around a cluster of stones, and a stray butterfly fluttered across his vision, drawing his eye for a fraction of a second. In that heartbeat of divided attention, the rival's steel was already at his throat. The swordsman looked down at his hands, overflowing with treasures that could not parry a blow. He realized that the mountain hadn't tried to stop him with monsters. It had defeated him with good things. He had traded his mastery for a collection of beautiful distractions, learning too late that the most dangerous enemy of a great goal is a series of small, glittering opportunities. The general sat in his silk tent, lit by a single lantern. Spread across the table was his most prized possession, a masterfully drawn map of the valley, commissioned 10 years ago by the king's own cartographer. It showed every hill, every forest, and most importantly, the great stone bridge over the Black River. This bridge was the center of his strategy. "We will cross here at midnight," he told his officers, pointing to the faded ink. "The enemy expects us to swim the rapids, but we will take the dry path and outflank them by dawn." One young scout stepped forward, his boots caked in fresh gray mud. "General," he stammered, "the spring floods 3 years ago changed the course of the water. The bridge was swept away. The river now runs a mile to the east through a deep gorge." The general didn't even look up from his parchment. He traced the lines of the old map with a trembling finger. "This map was drawn by the royal experts," he barked. "It represents the fundamental geography of this region. Rivers do not simply move, and stone bridges do not simply vanish from the record." He dismissed the scout as a coward who feared the rain. At midnight, he led 5,000 men into the darkness, following the precise coordinates of the decade-old ink. They marched with confidence, their armor clanking in the rhythmic certainty of the general's plan. When they reached the spot where the bridge should have been, there was nothing but a roaring, churning abyss of white water. The general, blinded by the authority of his old data, ordered the front ranks to push forward, certain that the bridge was merely hidden by the fog. The first 100 men marched straight into the black current and were gone in seconds. The general stood on the muddy bank, still clutching the dry, yellowed paper. He realized as the screams of his army filled the air that the world does not obey the record must obey the world. His expertise had become a blindfold, and by refusing to see the river as it was, he had turned his most valuable tool into a death warrant for everyone who trusted his vision. The man entered the marketplace at sunrise with a light step and an empty satchel. He was a man of good nature, possessed by a deep desire to be useful, to be liked, and to be seen as the reliable neighbor. At the first stall, a weaver stopped him. "Could you carry this small bundle of wool to the end of the street?" "It's on your way." The man smiled and nodded. "Yes, of course," he said, tucking the wool under his arm. A few steps later, a merchant asked him to watch a crate of spices for just an hour. "Yes, I can do that," he replied. Then came a woman with a crying child, a carpenter with a heavy beam, and a friend who needed him to stand in a long queue for a permit. To every request, to every minor favor, he gave the same cheerful answer, yes. By midday the man was no longer walking, he was staggering. The small bundle of wool had become a mountain on his back. The crate of spices was strapped to his chest, and he was balancing the carpenter's beam across his shoulders while the stranger's child sat atop it, pulling at his hair. Every yes was a thin, invisible thread that had now woven into a heavy shroud of obligation. He looked at the sun and realized he had forgotten his own errands. He had a garden to plant and a roof to mend, but he couldn't even turn his head to look toward his own house. The weight of other people's priorities had paralyzed his own limbs. As the market began to close, his neighbors thanked him and went home to their warm dinners, leaving him standing in the middle of the square, pinned to the cobblestones by 100 small favors. He realized that by saying yes to everyone else, he had been forced to say no to himself. His sovereignty had been traded away, one polite nod at a time, until there was nothing left of the man but a pack animal for the village's convenience. The harbor was a hive of frantic speculation. A dark line had appeared on the horizon, and the air had turned a sickly, bruised purple. On the docks, the young captains and the wealthy merchants were shouting at one another, arguing over the barometric pressure and the shifting direction of the wind. They held up wet fingers to the breeze and debated whether to trim the sails to the north or anchor in the shallow bay. One man produced a complex instrument of brass and glass, claiming that the wind would surely veer east by sunset. They were surrounded by a storm of data, a whirlwind of opinions, based on the visible signs of the sky. They were so busy talking that the noise of their voices drowned out the sound of the waves. In the middle of the chaos, the old captain sat on a wooden bollard, as still as a carved figure. He didn't look at the sky, and he didn't join the debate. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the water beneath the pier. He watched the way the kelp swayed and the specific, rhythmic pulse of the deep-sea swell that moved against the surface current. He felt a vibration in the wood of the dock that the others were too agitated to notice. While the crowd was still arguing about the wind, the old captain stood up, signaled his crew with a single-hand gesture, and began to move his ship toward the inner stone basin, the only part of the harbor with a foundation deep enough to break a tidal surge. He didn't explain his move, he just acted. An hour later, the wind did indeed shift, but it didn't veer east. It became a wall of water that surged from beneath the surface, a rogue tide that shattered the ships anchored in the shallow bay. The experts were still adjusting their sails when the surge hit. The old captain watched from the safety of the stone wall, his ship barely moving in the still water. He realized that the loudest signals are often the most superficial. True mastery isn't about winning the argument, it's about ignoring the noise of the wind to listen to the silent logic of the tide.